about the husband's leadership. That's what we were talking about last Sunday. And we saw that this is one of the principal responsibilities that God has entrusted to husbands, to lead their wives, to lead their children, their households. And that this is, the husband is in an inescapable position of leadership because he is the head. So headship is not a command, right? The husband is not commanded in Ephesians 5. Husband, you need to be the head. You need to grow into this whole headship thing. It's like, no, you are the head. And so be a good one, essentially. Just as Jesus is the head and not commanded to be the head, the same applies to husbands. We also worked through a bit about what this means as far as leadership, some areas of leadership. The first one being that the husband is to lead his family in making his household productive. And so we looked at, what does that mean? It means, casting the vision for your home, and all the family members, the husband really rallying the family behind him to follow him, everybody pitching in to make their household productive. We talked about things like the Industrial Revolution, how that affected household productivity and those things. And we'll expand more on that in later lessons as well. But with following on the heels of the productive household, I want to talk a little bit about decision-making, because those two things are really married together. If the husband is to cast the vision for the home and lead the home's mission, so to speak, well, decision-making naturally kind of comes up. Who makes the decisions? How does the wife fit into this? All these sorts of things. So that's where we will begin today. So all that talk of household management, order, productivity, it brings up that practical issue of decision-making. And this, as we all know, is a common area of conflict in marriages, right? Simply making decisions. So how should we approach this issue? A few things. And I'm going to talk sometimes more directly to the men here, the husbands, but there's also parts for the wives to really listen in on too. So the first thing is that as the leader, as I said, talking about household productivity, it's the leader's job, the husband's job to set the vision for the home. But he has to make sure that his vision aligns with biblical priorities. That's his job. His authority to cast the vision for the home is not some license for him to make boneheaded decisions. In other words, that he just then expects his wife and children to just hop on board when his decisions are frankly stupid. No, all major decisions that the husband makes must be, they're required by God to be, aimed at the well-being of his family, the building up of his household. And this is important because too many men make decisions that serve themselves and end up harming their families. So for instance, a few examples, a guy might thrust his family into debt because he bought a new truck that he wants but doesn't need. Right? Things like that happen. Some guys might relocate their families because he gets a better paying job. That's a great thing, perhaps, but it's at a cost. They suffer spiritually because they're not next to a solid church. A guy might move his family into a bigger and better house, not necessarily a bad thing at all, but at great financial cost or at the cost of being active members in a church. Maybe he relocates and the best church is now an hour away, and so these are all kinds of things the husband especially has to think about. So lots of guys do things like this because their priorities are not ordered by God's mission for their household, and so the man has to ensure that his priorities are straight, or else he's the one who's actually inviting conflict with his wife. When the couple is unified on their household vision, decision-making becomes much easier, doesn't it, and much clearer. And so that's the first thing about decision-making. The husband has to order his decisions after God's priorities for the home. Second, since the husband is the head, he has the final say in decisions. There is no mutual submission, if you want to call it that, in decision-making, because then nothing gets decided. If the husband is submitting to the wife and the wife is submitting to the husband, Nobody's leading, in other words. So husbands, don't be the passive husband who outsources this responsibility to your wife. When it comes to the trajectory and health of your family, the man needs to step up. Even if it means, we're going to talk about this for a minute, even if it means disappointing your wife. While the wife's happiness is a factor in decision making, it cannot be the unassailable guiding principle. Okay? You cannot let her happiness or your children's happiness dictate how you run the household, because emotions do not supersede what is good and what is right and what is true. But too many husbands live under the tyranny of their wives' happiness. And that's not an exaggeration. And this is captured by that worldly proverb that we've all heard a million times before: happy wife, happy life. Right? See, some of you knew what I was going to say. And it is a worldly proverb. It is not in the book of Proverbs. And husbands do this, they live this way. Why? Because they fear their wives. They fear the wrath of their wives. And they want to avoid conflict, keep the peace, so they prioritize their wife's approval over the Lord's approval. And this means the wife, if you think about it, the wife is then really steering the ship of the household, and she could be steering it in an unbiblical direction, like Eve did. Look at Genesis 3 and see how that worked out. Not too well. And so, wives, just because your husband makes a decision you disagree with does not automatically mean it is a sinful decision. In those cases, you need to beware, and this is another big problem, you need to beware of manipulating your husband with your emotions to get your way. And so the husband, for instance, might say, honey, we're going this way. And she says, no, I want to go that way. And then to get the husband on board, a lot of these wives will play the victim. And so they might say things like, to their husband, you don't care about me, you never listen to me, you don't consider my feelings, and sometimes they'll even start crying. And now I'm sure many wives, I don't want to assume the worst, but I'm sure many wives don't really understand what it is that they're doing in those moments. They're just reacting. They're not thinking about what their reaction really means. But what they're doing is emotional manipulation. Really, that's what it is. And it's incredibly common in marriage. It's incredibly common in Christian marriages. And it's absolutely destructive. Absolutely destructive. Ladies, your husband, understand that he has the responsibility to lead you by God. And he also, with that, has the authority to lead you. Okay? And so you need to follow him by submitting to his leadership, not by undermining his leadership, not by manipulating him to get him onto your side. That's number 2 in decision-making. Third, husbands, recognize that your wife is your most trusted advisor. Okay? This is really important too. It would be foolish and unloving to make big decisions that affect her and your children without consulting her. Okay? If the wife disagrees with her husband on something, that should hold a lot of weight for husbands, a lot of weight. And it's my belief that since marriage is a one-flesh union, that husbands and wives on major household decisions should strive for unity. Okay, that just, to me, seems really obvious. If unity isn't possible, then I think the next step, again, we're not talking about, whether to rent a movie. We're talking about big decisions. If unity on a big decision isn't possible, step 2, I think, would be the couple consult other trusted advisors. Maybe your pastor, maybe good friends in the church, other relatives, things like that. If unity still isn't possible, it's the husband's job to make the call. At the end of the day, that's the duty God has given to him. Fourth, and finally on decision making, none of what I said means that the husband should make every decision in the home. Wise and good leaders delegate. Okay, they don't micromanage. Micromanaging conveys a lack of trust, doesn't it? But husbands, your wife is your helper, who's bound to you by sacred covenant. And God calls her in 1 Timothy 5:4, the Lord calls the wife to also manage the household under the husband's direction and authority, but she is a household manager as well. And so husbands, recognize the areas where your wife is competent and capable, and delegate to her, especially as it concerns, domestic things, which the Lord has oriented the woman toward. So just to give a practical example in our household, Melinda largely oversees our finances, including our taxes and our investments, because she was an accounting major. She has an accounting degree. And so it would be pretty stupid of me to not utilize that strength that my wife brings to the table, that competency. But, along with that, she never makes a major financial decision without first bringing it to me, discussing it with me. And in those moments, as the head, I still have veto power. That's how things are supposed to work. So recognize, husbands, where your wife is competent and gifted and skilled, and delegate. That is not only loving, because it's respecting her as a person and utilizing her as someone who's essential to the health of the home, but it's also just wise. Any husbands that micromanage, it's like, goodness, I can't imagine making all the decisions in the home. That would just make my brain explode. So delegate, utilize your wife's strength. Any questions about decision making? Yeah.
So your third point, I'm wondering how you would distinguish that from the kind of like Keller style husband is just a tiebreaker when you absolutely can't agree. Deal with things which in practice never happens anyway because the wife runs the show.
Yeah, I do think the whole the tiebreaker thing, like at the end of the day, the husband does have the final call. And so I'm not against that tie-breaking language. I wouldn't necessarily use that. But again, it goes back to the idea that I don't believe it's loving, though the husband is the authority. If we're talking about major household decisions, we're going to buy a new car, we're going to go to a new church, we're going to relocate. Honey, I'm looking for new work, or whatever that might be. I think those kind of major household things, the husband should consult his wife. And listen to her. Again, that holds a lot of weight, what she says. Maybe she's like, yeah, I totally support, let's do this, or she objects for X, Y, and Z reason. I think husbands need to recognize that, their wives obviously do have a lot of wisdom and bring things to the table and see things from different angles that the husband might not see. And so again, to me, it's a love issue, but it's also a wisdom issue, because men have blind spots, women have blind spots, we need each other. But at the end of the day, if a husband wants to go this way and the wife this way, they've consulted advisors, they disagree at the end of the day, I do think if you want to call it a tie-breaking vote, the husband has that power because he has the authority. And in the same way, think about like our president, for instance. He head of the executive branch, but he's surrounded by advisors, right? And so, maybe that's a good parallel here, is he doesn't just, he calls the shots at the end of the day when it comes to the military, but he has the Joint Chiefs that advise him because, they know more than him on a lot of these things, but he still makes it go. So it's something like that dynamic, I think, is appropriate for the home. But that's a good question.
Yeah, I guess the sense I get from Keller and people within that general world is like it's a mere tie-breaking authority, where like the husband is not necessarily leading on the steps leading up to the point of needing to break the tie. That they're like
Okay.
totally like this,
Yeah.
set the way until you get to that just unresolvable disagreement.
Yeah, no, the husband has the authority from the beginning to end. Yeah. So I guess in that sense, I would disagree with that approach. But it's a good question. Any other thoughts on decision making? Linda? It's a good question. I mean, there's some assumptions there, and we're going to talk about this more when we get to the wife's section about submission, rather, because obviously submission is kind of what you're talking about, plays into this a lot, and there's nuances, distinctions to make, to be sure. But when I say there's assumptions there, so we're assuming the husband is not making a sinful decision. We're assuming he's leading his wife in a lawful way, not asking her to sin, not commanding her to sin, and it's just something that she doesn't want to do for whatever reason. She's called to submit and go along and die to herself. I mean, really, at the end of the day. Again, because otherwise, the wife is leading. If the husband has to cave to the wife's decisions because it upsets her, then he's living under the tyranny of her happiness. And that is a disordered household. So the man has to make sacrifices as the leader. The woman has to make sacrifices as the helper in the body. There's dying to self on both sides in different ways. But, it's thinking about going back to the model of headship and submission as Christ in the church is, there's a lot of commands that Jesus gives us that, that are hard and we don't like to do. I mean, think about when you're, really bitter towards somebody, whoever it is, and what does Jesus say? Go be reconciled. And you're like, I don't want to talk to that person, but I know I need to submit to Jesus and do it. It's kind of that way with husbands and wives. Again, I'm assuming he's not asking the wife to do something sinful. It's lawful, and she just disagrees for whatever reason, and she has to submit. Yeah. Other thoughts? Yeah, Paul.
You'll probably bring this up later, but supposing a husband was sinning in his decision, what should the wife do at that point?
Yeah, so if she hasn't sat down and talked to him about it, that's step one. Matthew 18 kind of style, go to the person first. After that, go to your pastor or somebody else that you both mutually respect and bring them into it. Because if the husband is leading his wife and family into sin, that does, eventually fall into the jurisdiction of the church and under the session. And, I would want to know about that if any husband in this church was leading his wife into sin and his children. That's a big problem. Now, we have to be careful there, too. Again, there's nuance to, just because the wife disagrees, be careful with playing the sin card, You got to be able to prove that it's really sinful and not just, I just don't like it, so there's caution there. But that does happen. Husbands, again, make boneheaded decisions or consciously make sinful decisions. So yeah, the wife certainly, I'm her pastor too. And so she has every right to come to me or to one of the elders and say, this is happening, we need help. My husband's not listening to me, and, those kinds of things when there's sin. Yeah.
I guess one thing too that I've heard people don't talk about is how much collective there is in submission.
Yeah.
And how we are trying to not in these major decisions that you're talking about, if you think a wife should say something and the husband saying where it's like the marriage should move forward together and obviously ultimately towards the end. But there are so many things that are less important than we need to fight about.
Mm-hmm.
The wife where there are times that I think that you just say okay and you go along. Sometimes you were wrong and your husband is right, and sometimes your husband is wrong, but there's still so much blessing and community of supporting him and not
Yeah.
I told you so when he was wrong. And I think every leader is that way where there's times when you're doing it for every meeting in your life and you're wrong, but you still are blessed by submitting to them. And I can say for our marriage that's been true where it's not that every time we make a decision I agree with him, but the Lord always blesses us for moving forward in the same direction and submitting to his order for our family.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. And I think I'm going to talk a little bit about that again in the wife section, but it's a great point here. I mean, wives, your husband is a sinner. He's not Jesus. He's going to make decisions and ask you to submit. It's not a sinful decision, but maybe in the end it shows that it was unwise and your husband was wrong. And it's just like, it's so That's such a good point that Sam brings up, that there is blessing and submission even in those moments, because it's a sanctifying thing. Like for husbands, you're sanctified as you're leading. For wives, you're sanctified as you're submitting. As you carry out your roles, you're both submitting to Christ, right? Because you're submitting to His design for the home, and so there's sanctification and all these things. But just for the sake of, again, it goes back to wisdom for the wives, just for the sake of peace in the home and peace in the marriage and those kinds of things, it's like really deciding like what's a hill to die on and what's not. I can go along with this. In the end, yeah, it might not work out. I might not get my way, but it's not about me getting my way anyway. It's about me submitting to my husband and letting him lead and, for the sake of peace in our marriage, dying to myself. Like there's something really good to be said for that. So that's a good point. The last thing that I want to get through as far as leadership is kind of a slight excursus, I've labeled it. But we've touched on it in some ways in this discussion, and it has to do with the word servant leadership. I want to talk about that for a bit. There is a popular misconception about leadership that wreaks havoc on marriages, and it centers on this term, servant leadership. Servant leadership is one of the buzzwords in evangelical churches. There's books on servant leadership for pastors to read, for husbands, for anybody in a leadership position. Servant leadership is kind of the thing. And that word is fine, depending upon how you define it. And that's, gets at the issue. What it often amounts to, in our kind of circles, is emphasizing the husband's service and de-emphasizing his leadership. And so he has all the responsibility of a leader, all the accountability of a leader. So think about that. If God gives you the responsibility to do something, you're accountable to him for that. So the husband has all the responsibility to lead. He's going to have to answer to God for how he's led his wife and children, but he doesn't really have any authority to lead. That's a common view of servant leadership. It's common in so-called complementarian circles. It's been said, I've heard others say before, that in egalitarian marriages, the wife leads. In patriarchal marriages, the husband leads. In complementarian marriages, the husband leads in all the ways the wife tells him he can lead. That was meant to be funny, but there's truth to that. So again, and we know another, just as we all recognize happy wife, happy life, we recognize that. The imagery I'm trying to capture here, you've heard this before too, is the husband is the head, but the wife is what? The neck. What does the neck do? Turns the head. That's kind of this view of servant leadership. And so, not only does the husband lead in the ways the wife tells him he can lead in this view, but he also has to serve in the ways she tells him to serve. And so the wife essentially takes the reins of headship, and often she'll blame the husband when things go south. If he makes a decision or she makes a decision that goes wrong, whatever the case is, he's to blame because, he has all the responsibility and all the accountability, but no authority. And in this view of servant leadership, male headship is nothing more really than a theoretical concept with no practical import. And so that headship principle in Ephesians 5, 22 to 24 gets flattened. So the husband is robbed of his authority. And a man with all the responsibility to lead but no authority to lead is essentially a slave. He's a slave to his wife. And now what this typically translates to in practice is the man doing his fair share of the domestic responsibilities and deferring to his wife and family decisions. And in case it's not obvious, this brand of servant leadership is heavily influenced by feminism. And so, I want to ask, and we'll go through some passages, how do feminists and those who advocate this view, how do they defend this view of servant leadership? Well, they appeal to Scripture, and I'm going to go through a few passages to just kind of debunk this idea. I want it to be firm in your minds, what servant leadership means and doesn't mean. So one text that's often cited to defend this egalitarian feminist view of servant leadership, is Mark 10, 35 to 45, and I preached on that not too long ago and kind of addressed this a little bit in that sermon. But that's where James and John ask to sit in seats of honor, power, and authority in Christ's kingdom. And Jesus answers, this is what he says, "You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." And so people will often say, see, Jesus says that authority in his kingdom is really about serving others. That's what he did. And in his incarnation, Jesus set his authority aside for the sake of serving sinners, even at the cost of his life. And so that means headship in the home isn't about authority, it's about service. That sounds kind of good, maybe at first glance, but the problem is that's not what the text says. Jesus' answer to his disciples reveals the heart of the matter. James and John's, their request stemmed from a desire for power and prominence. And this is why Jesus said that the rulers of the Gentiles lord their authority over those under their care. And so the problem, in other words, isn't that certain people have power and authority over other people. That is natural. Remember, at the beginning of the male headship lesson, we saw that God's world is a world of hierarchies. Authority over others in his world is a natural thing. It's a good thing. It's the way he designed the world. So that's not the problem, having power over others. The problem is that power, as we know, can sometimes go to your head, making you prideful, haughty, and this causes some rulers to abuse their power. But in Christ's kingdom, rulers shouldn't do this. They shouldn't be proud and power-hungry tyrants. By his own example, Jesus shows that good rulers are servants of the people. And so good rulers take responsibility for those in their care. They use their authority to provide and to protect and not to harm. Good rulers are loving, they're sacrificial, they're selfless and humble. A godly ruler is even willing to die for his people, just as Jesus died for his church. And so that passage is really about the character of a godly ruler. And this text says nothing at all about a good ruler having to give up his authority if he's to properly serve his people. It's not what Jesus did. Okay, proven by the fact that he commanded his disciples to do all kinds of things throughout his ministry. And keep in mind on that point that just as Jesus in his, from his incarnation to the cross, he was our suffering servant, right? Isaiah 53. At the same time, he was our King of Kings. He's both the suffering servant and the King of Kings. Our catechism talks about this. It says that Jesus exercises his office of a king both in his estate of humiliation, his public ministry up to his death, and in his estate of exaltation. So Jesus is always king, never surrendered his authority. Another commonly cited text to defend this view of servant leadership is Philippians 2, 3 to 8. Paul commands the Philippians there to put the interests of others above their own and to count others as more important than themselves. And so again, we're met with these concepts, these character qualities of selflessness, service, sacrifice, humility, these sorts of things. And Paul grounds all of this. He grounds his commands to the Philippians in the historical work of Christ, namely the incarnation and the atonement. And Paul says that Jesus emptied himself. Right? It's this passage that Jesus emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, humbling himself even unto death. And so, a lot of feminists, and by that I don't just mean lay people, but feminist scholars who've written commentaries on this passage, they'll say that Jesus gave up his authority to serve. And that's what husbands are then called to do. But like Mark 10, this passage is about the humble and sacrificial character of Christ, which are certainly indispensable qualities of a great leader, including a husband. And one of the husband's jobs is to protect his family, even at the cost of his life. And that's what Jesus did for the church. But Philippians 2 nowhere suggests that Jesus gave up his authority in the incarnation. To suggest this, and this is important, means you've drifted into heresy. Okay? The Bible teaches that Jesus is the God-man. He's both truly God and truly man, possessing a complete human nature, a complete divine nature in one person. This means he did not in any way set aside his divine authority in the incarnation. He veiled his divinity in human flesh, but his divinity was still truly and fully present. And again, this is why he gave commands to his apostles throughout his ministry. And if you remember, we saw this in Mark as well. It was Jesus who ordained his apostles to ministry and who gave them the authority to preach and to cast out demons and to heal and all these things. And so you cannot delegate authority that you don't have yourself, right? And then after his resurrection, Jesus also told his disciples that he possesses all authority in heaven and on earth. And so Jesus is the head of his bride, both in his estate of humiliation and exaltation, which is why the church submits to his commands. Finally, one more passage. People will cite John 13, 1 to 20 for this unbiblical view of servant leadership. And this is where Jesus washes his disciples' feet. After doing that, he says to his disciples, "If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done to you." In light of this, it's said that headship is not about authority. Instead, husbands should serve their wives by essentially helping out around the house. That's what these kinds of things translate to. But like the other passages I cited, this one is not, for one thing, directly about marriage. Though if you apply it to marriage, and I think you can indirectly apply it to marriage, but if you do that, then a wife should also wash her husband's feet because she's also a disciple of Christ. Right? This is a command that Jesus gave to all of his disciples. And furthermore, far from dismissing his own authority in that passage, Jesus actually reaffirms his authority in that text. In verse 16 of John 13, Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him." And what he's doing there, just to round it all out in that passage, is giving all of his disciples, man, woman, whoever you are, all of his disciples, an example of what it means to serve one another, that we are to be a people who serve one another. We understand that. But this example of service must be contextualized to our various relationships, including marriage. And so all of those passages, they condemn things like vanity and pride, self-promotion, which are not inherent to leadership and possessing authority. If those things were inherent to leadership, then you'd have to say Jesus is vain, that he is prideful, he is self-promoting because he rules over his bride, the church. A wrong interpretation of these texts, essentially, and when they're applied to marriage, all they do is they produce frustrated husbands. Frustrated husbands and effeminate husbands who essentially act as their wives' personal assistants. That's what this translates to. That's normal in the world, and sadly it's pretty common in the church. There are many Christian wives who do order their husbands around like children, assigning them various household chores as if the men are basically, the assistant homemakers. When the men don't do their chores, their wives then nag them, they revile them, they berate them and demoralize them. This is a prime example of ladies living out the curse of Genesis 3:16. And so, again, you see they've stripped their husbands of their headship and transformed them into the helpers, essentially. Now, can men help out with domestic duties? Of course. Of course they can. It's not forbidden, nor are wives prohibited from ever asking their husbands for help. Husbands, I think, should certainly look for ways to be helpful around the house when they can. I do dishes fairly often in our household. And I cook on occasion too. But couples, again, what we want to focus on here, and throughout this series, what we really want to focus on, we talk about exceptions, but we really need to get the rules down and the principles down. You have to have the biblical principles firmly in place, or else everything else falls apart. And one of the most important household principles is this, that the husband is not the helper. He is not the helper. God did not create the man to be the helper. He didn't orient the man toward the domestic sphere. Failure to understand and to implement this principle invites conflict in the marriage. We live in a church culture where it is absolutely blasphemous. It's anathema to suggest that wives should serve their husbands. Okay? And yet that's why the woman was actually created. Truly. 1 Corinthians 11:9 says that the man was not created for the woman, but the woman for the man. She was created to serve her husbands. Yes, in particular ways. No, not to be his slave and household servant. Get the nuances and charges out of the way. Nevertheless, she was created for the man, to be the helper. God has called her to help her husband by tending to those internal matters of the household. And so the domestic responsibilities fall primarily to her. And so let's return to that term of servant leadership and finish this section out. Egalitarians and many complementarians say it means that servant leadership means that the husband leads by serving. That's what they'll say. The husband leads by serving. That's servant leadership. But biblically, servant leadership means that the husband serves by leading. That's how you should understand that term, that the husband serves by leading. He serves his wife by leading her in the ways Jesus has called him to lead. And she serves him by submitting to him. Marriage is the relationship that God has instituted in the world for the protection and the provision of women and children. And God has given husbands real covenantal authority so they can carry out these responsibilities of provision and protection. And husbands are to wield this authority, as we've already talked about, not in service to themselves, not making boneheaded decisions. They're to wield their authority in service to their people for their good and for God's glory. Any questions about that? Heather, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, again, this is kind of goes back to, it's a good question. Did everybody hear that? Okay. So how do husbands and wives prevent alliances in the home, like the children, since mom is more oriented towards the domestic sphere and the nurturing of children, maybe they gravitate more naturally to her, and how do we prevent, them from liking mom more and not liking dad as much and, creating conflict that way? Something to that effect, right? Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to having the rules in place. I think it goes back to, in the early years, like the really early years, like 1 to 4 for kids, 0 to 4, there might be some of that more natural, like I'm going to mom when I fall down and hurt myself, and I don't think dad should get offended at his 2-year-old child when that happens, but I think, husbands and wives need to have their thinking straight on this, and there's different things, like mom encouraging and promoting and exalting her husband in front of the children goes a long way, even when dad's not around. But maybe dad comes up. He's off at work, mom's at home with 5 and 6 and 7-year-old kids, and for some reason dad comes up in conversation. Take that, build your husband up in front of your children. as the protector and provider and leader God has called him to be. So giving them a healthy vision of their dad. Dads, being a present father. Being a tender and nurturing father. Giving your kids hugs, kisses, telling them you love them often. Giving them attention. A lot of times, quality time, quantity time, both. It's both. A lot of dads, if mom's at home with the kids all the time, a lot of dads think, well, I just need to make up for that, with quality time, like taking a family vacation. It's like, well, family vacations are fine, but you need to be, quantity matters too, is what I'm getting at. You need to be present with your kids, not on your phone all the time, scrolling, taking joy in what gives them joy. And all that to say that helps cultivate a relationship between dad and the kids, so that they're not picking and choosing between mom and dad. That they love you both, they go to you both. And so that kind of thing. But that's a good question. I'm probably going to touch on more things related to that as we go along. That's good. Let me, so that's leadership. The husband, the father is to lead his family. Now we're going to move to provision, the next big heading, that godly patriarchs are to provide for their families. And we'll see how far we get. So the second expression of a husband's love, remember everything the husband does is wrapped in love. That's the foundation. He's to be a loving leader. Now he's to be a loving provider. This is the second expression of his love, provision. One of the chief responsibilities of a leader is to provide for his people. Again, going back to the gospel, Ephesians 5, Jesus died, gave his life to provide salvation for his bride. And that's the model men are to imitate. And so if men are to build up their households, then they need to provide the building materials. Okay, and so what does this look like? Well, the first kind of subheading is financial provision. Okay, remember that Adam and not Eve was put in the garden to work the land. Working meant cultivating the land in order to produce food. And so Adam's provision served the greater end of advancing God's kingdom. And since it was Adam's job to bring home the bacon, so to speak, that's every husband's job. Commenting on Titus chapter 2, verses 1 to 10, Matthew Henry writes this. He says that Christ is the head of the church to protect and save it, to supply it with all good, and secure or deliver it from evil. And so the husband over the wife to keep her from injuries and to provide comfortably for her according to his ability. And so on this topic of financial provision, it's important to know that while Scripture calls you to love all your neighbors, it's impossible to love all your neighbors in the exact same way and to the same degree. This is why the Bible orders our loves. And so simply put, you have greater affection for and greater responsibility for those closest to you. This means men are obligated to love their wives and children more than anyone else. The man must provide for his own household before he provides for anyone else's household. And this is so important. The Apostle Paul says this, 1 Timothy 5:8, "But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." Let that sink in. That's pretty strong. And what Paul is doing there is he's ordering the husband's loves. Okay, a man, in other words, should not financially support other people or other causes if it means seriously compromising his own family. Your wife and children depend on you. Husbands, you've covenanted with your wife. You made that decision. You made the decision to bring children into the world, and so those under your care are entitled to your provision. It's sinful then for men to neglect their family's welfare to provide for others. For instance, feeding children in Ethiopia is a noble thing, okay? But not at the expense of feeding your own kids, just to give a practical example. Giving money to missions is great, but not if you can't pay your electric bill. right? In fact, Proverbs 13:22 says, "A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children." And so, not only should husbands provide for their children, but they should strive to leave them and even their grandchildren an inheritance. That's what Proverbs says. A good man does that. You know, the idea of building wealth in Christian circles, the idea of building wealth, you know, is often seen as a bad thing. You know, we shouldn't be about money and all those sorts of things. And yeah, the Bible does give a lot of warnings, right, about riches. The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, Paul says. But money itself, building wealth, is not a bad thing. You know, wealth can be used for a lot of good purposes. Scripture encourages that. And so men should strive after it. Also in 2 Thessalonians 3:10, Paul writes, "If anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat." Again, pretty strong. This means a man who is able to work, but chooses instead to live off welfare is in sin. And this is serious, because what is he doing? Well, a few things, but one, he's stealing from the labors of others. It's even more serious if this man is a husband, he has a wife, and if he's a father, because then he's abdicating his duty to provide and instead letting the government and the taxpayers be the provider. And this also means that the modern stay-at-home dad is in sin, because he's passing off that provider role to his wife. The idea of a stay-at-home dad is foreign, totally foreign to world history and to Scripture. It's a modern invention. It really is. Unless this guy is recently laid off and he's searching for another job, and so that's why he's at home, or unless, obviously, again, these are the distinctions and the exceptions. Maybe he has a health issue that prevents him from working or working outside the home somewhere. You know, those things happen, but barring those exceptions, a man who just doesn't work and won't work to provide for his family, that man is in sin. And unless he repents, that man would be under church discipline. And now that the man is the provider, doesn't mean it's necessarily sinful. I've touched on this in other ways. It doesn't mean it's necessarily sinful for his wife to work. But again, we're laying down principles and rules. As the head, the husband is to be the primary breadwinner. And so men need to earn enough to support their families, and I would add in there, you know, to give to their churches, so that ideally their wives can be home with the children, at least while the children are young. Any questions on financial provision? Yeah, Luke. Right. Yeah, no, that's a great question. So how do you weigh the idea of financial? So maybe a husband makes more money working outside the home, but he has an opportunity to quit that job to start a business where he might initially make less, but he's at home more around his wife and kids. He can get them involved, like, you know, what's better kind of thing. I mean, these are wisdom issues. So the Bible gives us these principles that I'm laying out. And when the Bible gives principles, it rarely, you know, gives all the specific details of how to apply those principles in practice. So we have to use wisdom. So I think in a situation like that, you have to, you know, weigh your options, kind of do a cost-benefit analysis. What are the pros? What are the cons? You know, how much if I quit my job and go back into the home and have a home business of sorts, or even just working from home myself, how much of a pay cut is that? How much is that going to affect my family? Does that mean just tightening up the budget in a few areas, you know, cutting off some subscription services and things like that? Like, that's manageable. Or is it a more serious, you know, compromise to where it's like, this is, you know, suddenly we're going to have to eat or eat potato chips all day because we can't afford better food. You know, I mean, things like that. So you need to ask, like, how much of a cost is it? But if it's really, you know, not much, and it just means tightening up the budget a little, but you still cover all the main bases of the provision for your family, then I think that could be a really good thing. I'm really big into family businesses and enlisting, you know, the wife's help in those things, and you know, again, they're co-managers in a way. The husband's the head, but they're both called to manage it, and bringing the children in so they can kind of learn the ropes of finances and household productivity in a very good way. So I think that could be a really good thing, but you just have to, you know, sit down with your wife. Let's both look at this. Can we do this? Can we afford this, make this financial sacrifice? But yeah, I guess that's kind of my answer. Yeah, Jesse.
You may have already got this in part, but like, what about the situation where the husband is the primary financial provider, but the wife, like, I know that you've already said that it's not simple necessarily for a wife to be
Yeah.
bringing in income. Like, if it's a situation where it's like, we're struggling to make ends meet, like, family struggling to make ends meet on the husband's income alone, so the wife works part-time, so like just put them over the edge, you have to fill in that
Yeah.
gap. How do you discern that?
Yeah, I mean, that's, again, in the wisdom category. I think, you know, just step back and say sometimes these are good questions. Sometimes they're hard to answer because there's so many different factors involved. And so I'm thinking, like, how old are the children, for one thing? You know, are they really young? Because those early years really matter with mom, I believe. If the kids are in high school, that's different, you know, if they're, you know. But yeah, so you have to like kind of evaluate the factors that are kind of feeding into this issue. Maybe they don't have kids yet, in which case, you know, it's probably fairly easy for the wife, time-wise, to take care of the home and get a part-time job. You know, so that could be a viable situation. But there are different, like, what stage of life are you in? You know, do you have kids? How old are they? How many kids do you have? Like, all these different things factor into the equation. Also, I mean, you know, I don't want to say it's outside the realm of possibility, but there are times when a guy just needs to look for a better paying job, you know? And so you have to evaluate that too, is I can have my wife get a part-time job. What sacrifices would that mean for our household if she does that? Or I can try to get a better paying job so she can stay at home, and that's where she really likes to be anyway, maybe, or take care of, you know. So you have to evaluate those things. I think families are really wise to do that. Is this a time where maybe the husband needs to search around for a better paying job rather than making his wife kind of an assistant provider? I don't want to say that's always sinful, but these are just kind of the things that are wise to think about. Because if the wife is, you know, turned away again from the primary sphere that God has given to her, even if it's part-time, that comes with sacrifices, and maybe sacrifices for young children. And I'm really jealous, you know, to guard young children and mom's time with the young children. So these are things that just have to be weighed. Yeah.
Just a thought that better paying jobs aren't always the answer, though. People's budgets, you know, when you think their budget's tight, a lot of times there's going to be some cuts.
Yeah, good thing. Good point.
Even though a lot of times it seems don't really want to give up.
Yeah, no, that's a good point too. Thank you. See, this is why men don't always see things, and so I need a woman to point it out. No, that's right. No, that's great. Lori said, if you didn't hear, that sometimes a better paying job isn't the answer. That the family needs to first assess their budget, and can we make cuts? And in a lot of cases, you can make cuts. I mean, I know the economy stinks right now, and it has for a while. But there are often ways that families can make cuts, and so that the husband doesn't need to search for another job, and mom can stay home with the kids, because those are kind of the main things. And another aspect I'll just add to that, we have to close, I'm going to pray after this, but going to your deacons on that point. Before you make any big financial decision like that, consult the deacons. That's why we have deacons. That's one reason, is deacons can help you think through these issues. That's why they're there. And too often I think the diaconate is not consulted for these types of things, and that's, you have deacons at your disposal. And not just to write a check to pay a bill, though they can do that at the right time too, but really to consult and give counsel. So let me pray. We're out of time.